Steven Tyler has one of the most distinctive voices in music, but now we're kind of seeing a different side to this rock legend.
He is obsessive about the band and their music. He presses them hard for perfection.
I'm going to be big-headed right now, okay? I think my perfectionism and my busting everyone's chops is what got this band to where it is today.
For decades, Steven Tyler was the unstoppable voice of Aerosmith, the soundtrack of rebellion, heartbreak, and raw rock spirit. His screams, his whispers, his unstoppable energy defined generations and inspired countless dreamers. But behind the spotlight, time was catching up, and fate had one last cruel twist to offer. When the diagnosis came, it didn't just attack his body, it broke open something much deeper. This is the story of Steven Tyler, who stood fearless for half a century, until he had to face a truth that even he could not outsing. A shocking silence. Steven Tyler had lived his entire life through a microphone, sending his wild, powerful voice across stadiums, clubs, and every corner of the world that would listen. For years, he seemed unstoppable, a force of nature who refused to age, refused to break, and refused to bow out quietly. But in the fall of 2023, all that changed in a single heartbreaking moment. During the final rehearsals for Aerosmith's highly anticipated farewell tour, a high note cracked not just his voice, but the illusions of invincibility he had carried for decades. Tyler clutched his throat, pain shooting through him, as silence stole what had once been effortless. Doctors rushed in, tests began, and rumors exploded. But nothing could prepare him for the truth.
Hall of Famer Aerosmith announcing they will stop touring. Lead singer Steven Tyler's vocal cord injury forcing the band to call it quits.
A fractured larynx, an injury so rare and devastating that it threatened to end everything he had ever known. For a man who had survived addictions, collapses, and comebacks, this felt cruel beyond measure. The fans were told it was vocal strain, but behind closed doors, Tyler was fighting a battle he couldn't simply scream through. This wasn't just a setback, it was a moment that forced him to question who he was if he couldn't sing. And in that quiet, Steven Tyler was left alone with a fear he had outrun for 50 years. The fear of losing his voice forever. The day the music stopped. September 2nd, 2023 should have been a celebration. A thunderous opening night in Philadelphia where thousands of fans waited to hear Steven Tyler roar one last time. Instead, it became the day the music stopped. As he tried to hit a note that once came as naturally as breathing, something snapped deep in his throat. At first, there was confusion, then panic. Bandmates watched as Steven stepped back, eyes wide with pain, clutching at his voice like a wounded soldier guarding a fallen flag. Within hours, the show was canceled, and whispers turned to shock. News cameras rolled outside the venue, catching fans in tears, refusing to believe their hero could fall. Tyler, meanwhile, was rushed for tests that confirmed what he had feared, a fracture in the larynx, the very instrument that had carried his soul to the world. This wasn't an ordinary injury. It was a career-killing blow, the kind that left doctors unsure if he would ever sing again. And for Steven Tyler, there was no hiding from that reality. All those years of reckless, fearless singing had finally caught up with him, leaving him vulnerable, fragile, and suddenly silent. That night, as the stage lights dimmed and the crew packed up, one truth echoed louder than any applause ever could. The voice that had defined a generation was gone, maybe for good. And Steven Tyler was left to wonder if he would ever truly be Steven Tyler again. When the diagnosis hit home, the word fracture echoed through Steven Tyler's mind like a cruel joke. A fractured larynx, how could something so vital, so powerful, just break? For decades, his voice had been an unbreakable weapon, surviving high notes, gritty screams, punishing tours, and personal storms. But this time, no amount of rest or therapy could guarantee a comeback. As doctors explained the damage, Steven sat quietly, barely breathing, trying to process what they were telling him. The cartilage was weakened, the vocal folds unable to vibrate properly, and at 75, healing would be slow, if it came at all. Each word from the specialists felt like a nail in the coffin of his identity. Friends tried to comfort him, bandmates offered hopeful stories of recovery. But deep down, Stephen felt a grief that was hard to describe. It was more than losing a voice, it was losing a purpose. Music had given him his name, his pride, his reason to stand tall. Now it threatened to disappear, and no fame or fortune could fill that void. Behind closed doors, Tyler stayed mostly silent, clinging to the memory of 1,000 nights when his voice had soared without fear. As the weight of his diagnosis settled on his shoulders, he realized this was a battle unlike any other. This wasn't an overdose to survive or a rehab to fight through. This was a moment where even his willpower might not be enough to save him, and that truth was harder than any note he'd ever had to hit. The weight of silence. In the days following the heartbreaking diagnosis, the silence around Steven Tyler felt almost suffocating. For a man who had built his world on the roar of crowds and the crash of drums, this quiet was foreign and terrifying. Every morning he would test his voice, a simple hum or a whispered phrase, hoping something would return. But the sound was thin, broken, a ghost of what it had once been. Friends and family tried to keep his spirits high, reminding him of all he had accomplished. But nothing filled the emptiness left behind. The band gathered, trying to plan, wondering if there was a way to continue without him, but the thought felt impossible. There was no Aerosmith without Steven's voice. Even they knew that. Each conversation felt like a funeral, every discussion weighed down by an unspoken grief. And for Steven, the pain was deeper than a career ending. It was a piece of himself being stripped away. This was the voice that had saved him from addiction, had carried him through heartbreak, had brought him to life on stage. Without it, who was he? Nights were the hardest. He would lie awake, remembering the cheers, the lights, the sweat dripping from his scarf-covered mic stand as he belted out song after song. Now those memories felt distant, untouchable, like a dream slipping through his hands. And in that darkness, Steven Tyler finally realized the world could move on without his voice, but he wasn't sure if he could. A career on the edge. Steven Tyler had always lived on the edge, of sound, of style, of survival itself. But standing on the edge of losing his voice forever was a new and devastating frontier. It forced him to see what he'd been running from for years, the truth that no human body, no matter how wild and gifted, can outrun time.
There fractured his larynx last year. The 76-year-old's vocal injury led the band to postpone the rest of their Peace Out farewell tour.
As news spread of his injury, the world seemed to stop and listen. Fans across continents held their breath, praying their rock idol would somehow come back swinging. But behind the public statements, reality was setting in. Doctors were blunt. His vocal cords were damaged beyond a simple rest cure. The cartilage fractured in a way that could never fully heal. Steven listened, nodding, trying to stay strong, but a silent terror clamped around his heart. For decades, he had been more than a frontman. He was the living embodiment of Aerosmith's rebellion and raw passion. The stage was his second skin, the microphone his sword. Now both felt ripped from him. Joe Perry, his longtime partner in musical crime, visited often, promising him they'd find a way, but even Joe couldn't disguise the fear in his eyes. For Tyler, the questions came like a flood. What if I can never scream again? What if I can't perform? Who am I then? Those thoughts left him staggering, like a boxer after the final bell, unsure if he'd ever stand in that ring again. And in that terrifying quiet, Steven Tyler faced a heartbreak far deeper than any song could ever describe. The echo of the past. In the haze of uncertainty, Steven Tyler found himself drifting back through memories, 1,000 shows, 1,000 faces, every wild night that had defined him. He could almost smell the stale beer on club floors, hear the first chords of Dream On rising from battered amps, feel the sweat-soaked scarves tied to his mic stand as he twisted his body to every beat. Those echoes of the past felt both comforting and cruel. They reminded him of the unstoppable force he once was, yet made the present seem even more painfully quiet. In those flashbacks, he saw the kid who had been too restless for classrooms, who found a reason to breathe in the howl of rock and roll. That kid had become a legend, conquering addiction, heartbreak, and even death-defying stunts, all thanks to a voice that refused to give up. Now that voice was broken, and he couldn't help but wonder if all those years of screaming, pushing, and defying limits had finally come home to collect their price. The stage had been his sanctuary, a place where he could heal by giving everything away to the crowd. But now, there was no stage, no roar, no place to pour out his soul. And as the memories flooded him night after night, Steven Tyler understood something he'd never had to face before. He might have to learn to live without the thing that had saved him. The echo of his past felt louder than any applause, reminding him how precious every note had been, and how easily it could all slip away. Fans left waiting. While Steven Tyler battled this nightmare behind closed doors, a world of fans waited anxiously, clinging to hope. From Tokyo to Boston, millions who had grown up with his music felt a personal ache, knowing the voice that defined their lives might never sound the same again. Ticket holders from the farewell tour stared at their unused stubs, unable to accept that the final bow had turned to silence. On social media, tributes poured in, videos of live shows, old interviews, moments when Tyler seemed invincible. People shared stories of the first time they heard Sweet Emotion, or how Dream On had pulled them through heartbreak. Their memories made it clear, Steven's voice wasn't just about music. It was woven into their lives, stitched into memories of love, rebellion, heartbreak, and hope. Seeing their idol struck down so suddenly was like losing a part of themselves. Meanwhile, Tyler struggled with the guilt of letting them down, replaying their loyalty in his mind. These were people who had stuck by him through his worst battles, cheered him through every comeback, forgiven every slip-up.
All these people lining up to walk this way to see Aerosmith rocking out at the Mass Mutual Center come August.
Now he felt he was failing them when they needed him most. But no one blamed him. They loved him too much for that. Even in their disappointment, fans reminded him he was still their hero. Their compassion was a lifeline, a reminder that while his voice might fade, the connection he'd built would never die. And that truth became a fragile comfort as Steven faced the hardest chapter of his story yet. The band faces reality. As the weeks passed, Aerosmith had to face the truth no one wanted to speak out loud. The tour, which was supposed to be a thunderous farewell, had collapsed before it could even begin. Behind closed doors, the band wrestled with impossible choices. Could they go on without Steven Tyler? Could they replace the irreplaceable? Even suggesting it felt like a betrayal. Joe Perry, Tom Hamilton, Joey Kramer, and Brad Whitford gathered in hushed meetings, replaying the same question over and over, but the answer was always clear. Steven was Aerosmith. There was no band without his unmistakable wail, no show without his electric energy on stage. Canceling the tour felt like cutting out a piece of their souls, but carrying on felt unthinkable. Steven himself refused to talk much, lost in a swirl of grief, anger, and disbelief. The weight of his silence was heavier than any argument. When he finally spoke, his words broke the room. "We don't cheat the fans," he said quietly. That ended the debate. There would be no fill-ins, no backing tracks, no illusions. They would rather end the story with honesty than fake one last goodbye. It was a painful, humbling decision, but it was also the only one that honored what they had built together. In that moment, the band realized this was bigger than a tour or a paycheck. It was about loyalty to their fans, loyalty to their own legend, and above all, loyalty to the man whose voice had carried them all for half a century. The day it all ended. December 1st, 2023, arrived with a heavy chill in the air and an even heavier chill in the hearts of millions. That was the day Aerosmith officially canceled their farewell tour, releasing a statement that felt like a funeral announcement for an era. The words were simple, respectful, but devastating. Steven Tyler's voice would not return for the foreseeable future, and they could not continue. Around the world, fans read the news in shock, some in tears, others numb. For them, Aerosmith was more than a band. It was a way of life, a soundtrack to their greatest memories. Losing the chance to see Steven Tyler belt out Dream On one last time felt like being robbed of closure. As the announcement made headlines, Tyler stayed mostly silent, watching the world react from a distance. Inside, he was shattered, yet strangely relieved that the truth was finally out. There would be no more pretending, no more hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come. For the first time, he could stop fighting and simply grieve what he had lost. The silence of his phone that night felt as loud as any stadium roar, a final confirmation that the ride was truly over. Even in that crushing moment, Tyler refused to let self-pity drown him. He had been through too much to fall apart now, but somewhere deep down, he knew he would never be the same. That day, the stage went dark, the spotlight died, and Steven Tyler took his first steps into a world without the voice that had made him a legend. The unthinkable diagnosis. For fans, the words fractured larynx sounded technical, maybe even fixable. But for Steven Tyler, it was unthinkable. His entire life had been built around a throat that could roar like a lion or cry like a child, shifting between rock anthems and heartbreak ballads. Now, doctors explained that the cartilage had split in a way rarely seen outside of brutal accidents. There was no clean surgery to stitch it together, no easy fix. Every word from the specialists felt like a sledgehammer, pounding away at his hope. Even if the fracture healed, the tissue would be weak, unpredictable, and easily damaged again. Tyler sat in stunned silence, realizing he might never trust his own instrument again. The voice that had saved him countless times, that had carried him through addiction, fame, and unimaginable lows, was no longer reliable. And for someone whose entire identity was wrapped in performance, that loss was catastrophic. He tried to imagine standing on stage again, mic in hand, but the vision collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. Could he risk one more scream, one more note, knowing it might destroy what was left? The fear was paralyzing, bigger than any drug or any bad headline. Steven Tyler had always been the guy who pushed through, who refused to quit. But now, the only thing he could do was rest and hope. For a man who had fought to control every beat of his life, surrendering to this diagnosis was more painful than any scar he'd ever worn. Remembering the first dream, in those long, quiet days after the announcement, Steven Tyler found himself revisiting memories that stretched all the way back to his childhood. Before the sequins, the scarves, the stadiums, there was just a restless kid in Yonkers who couldn't sit still in school, who felt misunderstood until he heard rock and roll for the first time. He remembered the Rolling Stones on the radio, the rawness of Mick Jagger's voice, and how it felt like freedom crashing straight into his chest. That was the moment he realized music could speak for him when words fell short. It saved him then, just as it would save him through broken relationships, addictions, and wild nights that nearly ended him. Now, facing the greatest silence of his life, those early dreams came back to him. Maybe they were there to remind him who he was, beyond the roar of the stage. A boy who loved melody, who loved to move people, who wanted to belong. Sitting at a piano in the dim light of his studio, Tyler pressed the keys slowly, feeling music still living in his bones, even if his voice refused to answer. The notes were shaky, imperfect, but they were honest, and that was enough. As tears came, he didn't fight them. After all these years, maybe he finally understood that even if the stadiums went dark, the dream that first saved him could still burn bright. Because music wasn't only in his voice, it had always been in his soul. A band of brothers. As Steven wrestled with this devastating new chapter, the bond with his bandmates grew more important than ever. Aerosmith wasn't just a band, it was a family, forged in chaos and triumph, tested by addiction, fame, and time itself. Joe Perry, Tom Hamilton, Brad Whitford, and Joey Kramer had seen every side of Steven Tyler, from his unstoppable energy to his darkest, most broken moments. Now, they gathered around him again, offering support in the only way lifelong brothers could, without pity, without fake comfort, just raw, honest presence. They sat together, sharing old stories about tiny clubs and smoky bars, laughing at memories of the fights and the wild tours that nearly killed them. They reminded Steven of everything they had survived, of how many times they had beaten the odds. And though no one said it directly, they all felt it. If this was truly the end of Steven's stage career, then they would stand with him to the very last moment. There would be no replacement, no tribute singer, no hologram show to fake what could never be duplicated. Aerosmith was Steven Tyler, and Steven Tyler was Aerosmith. That truth was as solid as the music they made. In those moments of quiet brotherhood, Steven felt a spark of hope. Even if his voice never roared again, he wouldn't have to face the silence alone. That, more than any medicine, felt like the first real healing. Because some bonds can outlast fame, outlast heartbreak, and even outlast the sound of a legend's voice. Finding a new rhythm. After the dust settled and the public heartbreak eased, Steven Tyler realized he could not simply vanish into the shadows. Even if he could no longer command a stadium with a single scream, his creative fire was still burning. Slowly, he began to explore new ways to share his gifts. In the studio, he poured himself into remixing classic Aerosmith tracks, revisiting old tapes with a fresh ear. Each note reminded him of battles won and miracles pulled off, a living history of a band that should never have survived, but somehow did.
Aerosmith Steven Tyler donated $500,000 to renovate a home at Youth Villages in Bartlett. It's called Janie's House after Aerosmith's 1989 hit song.
Beyond music, he turned to Janie's Fund, the charity he had founded to help abused and neglected girls. The mission suddenly felt even more personal, a way to channel all the raw pain of losing his voice into something healing for others. Friends noticed him smiling again, even if it was faint, as he spoke to survivors whose courage reminded him of his own. On quieter days, Steven scribbled in journals, wrote scraps of lyrics, and toyed with painting, searching for a way to release the energy that had once exploded from stage monitors and Marshall amps. It was different, slower, and less certain than the adrenaline of a live show, but it was real. That authenticity kept him grounded. He would never stop being an artist, even if the world had to learn to hear him in a different way. And as he stood surrounded by old guitars and golden records, Steven Tyler understood the rhythm of his soul was still alive, just waiting for a new song. A voice beyond the stage. As the weeks turned into months, Steven Tyler began to accept that his voice might never return the way it once was. But instead of letting that define him, he found a strange kind of peace in it. Fans continued to send him messages, sharing stories of how his songs had saved them through heartbreak, loss, or moments of pure rebellion. Those voices reminded him that his legacy was far bigger than one tour, or even one lifetime. His voice had already become part of people's DNA, woven into wedding dances, road trips, and quiet nights alone, with the volume cranked up. That realization comforted him on days when he felt weakest, reminding him that the gift he gave the world would never truly be silenced. He began to connect with fans in new ways, posting memories, old rehearsal tapes, and reflections on social media, letting them see the human behind the rock god. The honesty only made them love him more. If the stage was gone, he would still be present, still sharing, still creating, still inspiring. Even without the roar of the arena, he had a voice that could speak through acts of kindness, through stories, through every kid who ever picked up a mic because of him. That was the magic no diagnosis could steal. In this new chapter, Steven Tyler discovered that true legacy doesn't live in spotlights or screaming crowds. It lives in the millions of hearts you touch, and that kind of voice never goes quiet. The final bow, without regret. Steven Tyler always believed a performer should leave it all on the stage. No half measures, no faking, no apologies. And though fate had forced him to step away before he was ready, he refused to feel regret. After all, he had survived far worse than a fractured larynx. He had beaten addiction, outlived the chaos of rock's most dangerous years, and stood taller than any of the critics who had once predicted his downfall. That alone was a triumph. In quiet moments at his home, he reflected on the millions of fans who had roared back every lyric, on the kids who had found courage in Dream On, and on every bandmate who had stuck by him when the lights went out. He had built a legacy that was raw, messy, and achingly human, just like real life. And if his career was ending with silence rather than a deafening encore, maybe that was fitting in its own strange way. No manufactured farewell, no empty spectacle, only the truth and the honesty that had always been his greatest gift. When he looked out across the ocean from his porch, a guitar still resting by his side, Steven Tyler felt at peace. Somewhere, the music would keep playing, whether from a speaker, a cover band, or a teenage dreamer learning to scream like he once had. That was enough. And with that understanding, he took a quiet, powerful bow. No curtain, no crowd, just a man who had given the world his voice and found that even when it broke, his spirit never would. Steven Tyler's story is more than chords, more than shows, more than a single voice. It's a testament to survival, a reminder that even legends bleed, fall, and rise again in ways we can all understand. Though the stage lights have gone dim, the songs will live on, echoing through car speakers, karaoke bars, and the dreams of every kid who dares to stand tall and scream their truth. Tyler may never belt another note from center stage, but he has already done enough to fill lifetimes. His legacy isn't measured in perfect pitch, but in the courage to keep showing up, to keep living, to keep dreaming, no matter how many times the world tries to silence you. If you ever feel lost, remember Steven Tyler's journey, the heartbreak, the rebirth, the unbreakable will to keep going. Because in the end, that spirit is what makes a true rock star live forever.